More about where the protests and the movement stand now is Randy Blazak. He is the chair of the Coalition Against Hate Crime and a sociology professor, and he joins us now live from Portland. Thanks so much for being with us, Randy. First, tell us, what is it about Portland that's really kept the movement going and in the eye of the media in particular, and attracted so much negative attention from the White House?
Well, Portland has its own long history of racism, including in policing, but it also has a history of protest. This was also the center of the Occupy movement 10 years ago. And there's kind of a radical tradition in Portland that goes back to its founding. So it's not surprising, especially based on the demographics of the city, which is kind of a disproportionately white middle class city, but also high levels of education, that this becomes a center for change for the rest of the country. I mean, we often think the way that Portland goes, so goes the rest of the country on many of these key social issues.
As it stands today, though, in Portland, what have the protests gained so far? Where has it left your city and the national movement?
Well, it's been very intense, and especially since we had the arrival of federal law enforcement a few weeks ago that kind of changed the narrative as President Trump tried to crack down on the protests. It had the exact opposite effect. It actually brought more people downtown to where the epicenter of the protest is. But it's really helped to focus a lot of the attention on what this moment in history means. We've had significant reforms throughout the years, going back to the 1960s, where we sort of fixed little things within law enforcement. But right now we're having a sustained conversation about systemic racism in the system, that you can't just fix little things around the edges. You have to really take a complete look at the entire way that criminal justice works in America and the racism that is built into it. And so we're now engaged in this national conversation about how do we change the system? How do we
Right.
not just reform, but how do we create real sustained change that reduces these things that you talk about, including the murder of unarmed African American citizens?
You'd said before that you don't think these protests will actually stop until that systemic change is achieved. But when we look at how ingrained some of these issues are in the U.S. justice system, you talked about the criminal justice system, the prison system in the United States, for example, that could take a long, long time. So what kind of immediate progress are you looking for, and long-term progress, in order to stop these protests from happening?
Well, I think protest is a part of American life, and so we'll always have some form of protest. But what this movement has done is brought out this notion of defund the police. What does that really mean? And how much of our resources do we spend on sort of catching the bad guy instead of preventing the person from committing the crime in the first place? So there's now this conversation that's never happened as long as I've been doing this work about how do we spend the money differently instead of spending it on kind of law and order and locking people up. Things like mental health services or homeless services or social services that might prevent the crime and actually make the job easier for law enforcement. That is a new conversation. And while that might not be an overall systemic change, it's a pretty deep change from the way that we've just dealt with reform in the past.
Okay, Randy Blazak, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us there from Portland.